Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, there is interesting evidence that Omicron could be moving from humans into wild animals, this being distinct from past evidence of it moving into domesticated animals. The past research indicating various vitamins and treatments could or could not work, and how different evidence has either supported or failed to support this. The ever-growing incidence of measles amongst certain areas of the world, and just why the number of cases is increasing. Further evidence of just how and why Ebola may be able to hide, not just hide, but hide within the brain. Weird animal behavior, and astronomical news that covers a variety of interesting items. The timestamps for each of these news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the movement of COVID-19 and specifically the Omicron variant from humans into wild animals. Researchers in Pittsburgh have been watching the deer in their area. What they've observed is that the white-tailed deer appears to have a rather high incidence of the coronavirus within them. That's weird. There are at least 20 deer that have been identified as being infected with the Omicron variant. This is not just limited to the Pittsburgh area. It has been identified in white-tailed deer in 15 states across the continental USA. This event is important for a variety of reasons, but the biggest and perhaps most pressing is, in theory, a wild animal could become a reservoir for the CCP virus and keep it in circulation for many, many more years and allow for it to mutate and reinfect humans, just as other coronaviruses have done with bats. With deer being rather prevalent in mainland America, there's also a good chance that due to proximity to humans, transmission back with a new variant is entirely possible. Looking at that, we already have cause for concern, but there's further evidence that nature, to a certain extent, may be conspiring against us. Primarily, a link between vitamin D deficiencies and infection risks. There is past evidence looking at Europe that found that lower vitamin D levels tended to be associated with higher risk of infection. Now, an Israeli study has found that this difference could be even more significant. The research can be summarized as this: if you are vitamin D deficient, your chances of developing severe illness are much higher, whereas less than 10% of those who had adequate vitamin D would get seriously ill. This means that you have a much, much higher risk if you don't get at least a little bit of sunlight on you, and enough vitamin D in your diet that would then be activated by this sunlight. The problem with this research is that it is quite small in size, involving a little over 250 people. Further, the rest of the body of research around this hasn't been conclusive. There has been some evidence to support the use of vitamin D supplements, and that it has lowered the risk of severe infection. Others have found that it does not increase the risk. This could very much be like with vitamin C, wherein, if you are deficient in your dietary intake, adding the vitamins needed will improve your health outcomes. If your intake is already adequate, increasing intake will do nothing for immunity or overall health. On the topic of viable treatments, Ivermectin is once more in the spotlight. This time, again, not for good reason. In fact, it's an article that explores just how some unscrupulous actors are taking advantage of skepticism on the right and stupidity on the left in order to provide prescriptions for ivermectin incorrectly. Currently, there is no approval from any administration, such as the FDA, the National Institute of Health, the American Medical Associations, or anyone else for that matter, that would suggest ivermectin should be given to treat COVID-19. That's a big and very important piece of information to keep in mind. Nobody has been approved to sell it to treat COVID-19. Despite this, the article goes into detail as to how a journalist was prescribed ivermectin through a doctor via an online service. And admittedly, telehealth medicine is one of the big developments from COVID-19. It avoided many of the issues of direct contact between physician and patient, thereby mitigating the risk of infection. It still allowed for most every service that was required. The problem is those unscrupulous actors that we mentioned. In this case, one particular doctor who was working with a larger company in order to provide phone-in prescriptions, and each time they would charge $90 for the call. That's a very expensive prescription. These prescriptions can be given out at a very high rate, which means they generate a lot of money. The other noteworthy point is that it's not just one doctor doing this, and the article goes into detail about one doctor from Alabama who has been disciplined multiple times for using similar sorts of approaches to act in a way that's not proper, let's say, with regards to billing to the federal government. The most egregious example of this that we could read in the article was when the doctor requested prostate exams for women. If you aren't aware, women don't have prostates. It is a specifically male organ. The article goes into much further detail, especially around the use of prescription drugs in a hospital that medical staff and professionals may not be aware of. And we strongly suggest you read it, as it takes up some interesting arguments that are certainly worth contemplating. While still on the topic of ivermectin, we should talk about the evidence for its use, or more accurately, the dwindling evidence for its use, as yet another paper that was used to support ivermectin's use for COVID-19 has been retracted. The paper we're talking about is a preprint publication from March 2021. It was largely based on the idea of a government agency dispensing ivermectin to a very large number of people and seeing what would happen. The problems with that approach are myriad, and the attempt to have it removed were able to push the preprint archive or server to withdraw it, and the grounds for their withdrawal is that it was spreading misinformation and promoting an unproven medical treatment. The paper is part of and justification for a government program that unethically dispenses unproven medication without proper consent, ethical protection, or to the standards of human subject research. The paper is medical research and was purporting to study the effects of medication on a disease outcome and is not within the scope of that particular journal. The authors did not properly disclose their conflicts of interest. To give a little more detail, the paper itself appears to be based on a variety of flawed methodologies, and so the conclusions they reach can't really be relied on. This means that they're spreading a story that really isn't based on anything that can be relied on. Admittedly, the idea of misinformation isn't one that we entirely agree with. The second part, and this is perhaps the more important part of it, is the unethical nature of it. Everybody involved did not have the necessary informed consent, sign consent forms, get your general research documentation that any participant in a research project should have to know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what's going to happen. They were just given medication, and unproven medication. This is human research on a large scale, and that is a big no-no. Although the world failed to learn from Mengele, they did take note after Tuskegee. There is also the third point regarding the suitability for the journal it was submitted to. Admittedly, most journals will have a reasonably narrow scope. Some will be very broad, but they will also have a certain band of subjects to each side of the scope of things they will cover that you can generally squeeze into, so long as you can justify its submission. If it is a good article, well written, well evidenced, and everything makes sense, it's unlikely to be rejected because of scope, if you can fit it to what they've done. This did not do that. Medical research for a social research journal. Finally, the conflict of interest, and this one is one that's somewhat more important, not just with the relationship to this article, but to the researchers themselves. The conflict of interest is another big no-no, especially with regards to medical research. Based on the 4 points we've mentioned, it was effectively withdrawn, but they haven't withdrawn it in terms of completely deleting it. Rather, they've done something that they call tombstoning. That is, all of the paper's metadata will remain exactly where it is, and so if you go searching for the citations, they will take you to this webpage that tells you it has been withdrawn. The other noteworthy part of this is that, unlike many other withdrawals, this was not done with the agreement of the authors. In fact, it was largely unilaterally done by the preprint server. The authors have written in response to the Retraction Watch website, stating that they believe that it was not done properly and that it was motivated by politics. Where ivermectin is an unproven, unsubstantiated, and likely ineffective treatment, there are others coming out that could well prove to be more effective, or at least just as effective, as vaccines. After at least 2 years of work towards developing treatments for it, we currently are sitting on a number of possible direct vaccines that need to be injected, whether they are 1, 2, or booster shots. There are also a variety of supplemental treatments, things like monoclonal antibodies. These are pretty much the extent of what we currently have available. Researchers haven't been sitting idly by. Many people are reticent to get the vaccine, not necessarily because they're anti-vaxxers, but because of all the side effects associated with it. Most of these are short-lived. Pain in the site of injection, swelling, and possibly some fever and discomfort overall. They aren't particularly bad side effects, but understandably nobody wants to be in unnecessary discomfort. This is where a nasal spray comes in, that provides the effects of a vaccine, but with almost none of the aforementioned side effects. The way it works is surprisingly straightforward. Much like vaccines such as those used for influenza, they take a small part of the virus, and it's a part of the virus that the immune system can learn to recognize. It's sprayed into the nose, and from the nose the immune system picks it up and carries it off to where it needs to go. From there, the body begins to mount an immune response, just like it would with an injected vaccine. Admittedly, this is early research on a preprint server and conducted in mice, so need to take this with a rather large grain of salt. This research is based on the idea of having an initial dose of a vaccine. That initial dose was given as an injection. 2 weeks later, the nasal spray was provided for one group, but not the other. In the group that just received one dose of the vaccine, 80% of the mice died. The second group that received both the vaccine and nasal spray, none of the mice died. As with other research we've already mentioned in this video, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt given that it is very preliminary, animal-based research, and there could be differences between what they observe in mice and in humans. But the concept, if it works for COVID-19, could be extremely useful in trying to develop vaccines for other illnesses. Think about what it would be like if you get your influenza vaccine, get a booster 2 weeks later with a nasal spray. You could have significantly better immunity to the seasonal flu than you would currently have. Going from COVID-19 to another communicable disease, and yet another communicable disease for which we have vaccines: measles. Fairfax County Health Department in Virginia has identified a case of someone who has measles after traveling internationally. This is very similar in some respects to what was going on in New York before the outbreak of COVID-19. Unfortunately, very much like some of the COVID-19 variants, it is very infectious, and it can take some time for symptoms to develop. In fact, the health department has advised that it may take until February 24th for symptoms to appear. That means you may be waiting more than 2 weeks to see whether or not you were inadvertently exposed to this. It's worth remembering that we've mentioned there is a vaccine for this, but the person who was infected was unvaccinated. This is likely how they were not only able to be infected, but bring it back to America and possibly infect others. Going from medical news that is, well, frankly disappointing, to medical news that should give you some hope and possibly restore some of your faith in humanity. A man who has been paralysed in 2017 after a motorbike accident has been able to walk again thanks to a prosthesis that was implanted into his spine and allowed for the electrical impulses from his nerves to allow his muscles to work. To reiterate, the man effectively had a broken spine and can now walk again. The implant is relatively large at about 6 centimeters, and it has to interface with a computer that the patient has to have with them. What this allows is for electrical stimulation of the nerves. This then allows for muscles to be activated. The important parts to this are that the current cohort of people who have been treated with this device, the 3 of them, were injured at least a year before they were given the implant. The hope is to be able to bring it forward to a closer date to injury and allow for something similar to what 2 of the participants have. That is, ability to trigger nerve impulses, albeit weakly, without the device. One of the difficulties with this is that the implant is only suitable for those who have been injured between their neck and their lower thoracic area of their spinal cord. That's because it needs a relatively large area of undamaged spinal cord to be able to work. Moving over from clinical research in terms of humans to somewhat clinical but primarily biological research that uses human cardiac cells. The research was able to develop what is described as a fish from a human cardiac cell, and by using the movement of that muscle cell, it can swim. At the same time, this is the same behavior we see in a beating heart. The same mechanism allows it to continue beating for more than 100 days. So far, this all sounds rather impressive, if not somewhat Frankensteinish. The research, at least as far as the researchers are concerned, is not important because they've made a weird, moving fish-like thing, but because they could build an artificial heart from stem cells derived from a child, and then create a heart that could be implanted into them. This heart would be able to beat in response to the blood pressure in the body, and from this, they would be able to mitigate some of the issues around needing to stimulate the heart with neurons. The researchers explain that the weird design of it is that as one side of the strange creature contracts, it forces the other side to stretch. When this side stretches, it's then immediately going to initiate its own contraction. As it contracts, the other side expands again, and this will continue to self-perpetuate based on the ongoing stretch and expansion on each side. Still looking at clinically relevant research, but moving from the quasi makeshift heart that was created using stem cells to established brains and where Ebola may be hiding within it, so that it can then emerge later and begin straining if not killing the human host once more. One of the big issues with Ebola is that assuming that you survive, there is a good chance you're still infected. Remembering, Ebola is a virus. Since it's a virus, it hides within host cells to replicate. Most of the time, the immune system can track down all of these unwilling and unwitting hosts, destroy them, and remove the virus that way. There are still times where it will miss certain hosts, or parts of the brain where it can't readily access and therefore can't do its job. The brain is one of these locations. The researchers were looking at the brain of 36 macaques who had been treated for Ebola and survived. They found that there was a large amount of the virus hiding in parts of the forebrain and brain stem in 7 of them. These 7 rhesus macaques passed away in a rather unpleasant manner, and many of the symptoms that were observed with them were also found to be observed in humans who experienced relapses of a similar kind. It's also further supported by evidence in humans of viral load within cerebrospinal fluid. That opens the door for long-term reinfection once someone thinks they are cured. Still in the clinical sphere, but moving from possible long-term reinfection to long-term use of cannabis. Cannabis is a fairly common recreational drug. It's also increasingly available legally, either through a dispensary with a medical prescription or taxed, and therefore available to the public as a recreational drug. Cannabis is something of a controversial drug choice, and whether it's approved medically or in general terms, often leads to a division in people. Many argue that it's a gateway drug, leading to more destructive drug uses later in life. Others argue it is a relatively harmless substance. The debate will no doubt rage on for a long time yet. The question is whether or not it has an effect over the long term based on what we can currently investigate. This is where the research we want to talk about comes in. It's about lung function and cannabis use, and how this will differ from the use of tobacco. Fundamentally, this is a longer-term study. The majority of participants started 13 years ago, and they've continued to collect data on them since. They found that both tobacco and cannabis had effects on the lungs. Admittedly, both were detrimental, so it's not good for you to be smoking either way. One thing that was different between tobacco and cannabis is that cannabis led to overinflated lungs and increased resistance to airflow, more so than tobacco did, which is an interesting insight. Where this gets difficult to tease apart whether or not you should look at it as tobacco is better or worse than cannabis is that many of the participants consumed both. Looking at the subset of cannabis alone versus tobacco and cannabis, the cannabis cohort alone had a similar pattern of deleterious effect versus the combined group. So it appears that even if you only smoke cannabis, there is a negative effect for you. Being a study based on the idea of observing people and their self-reporting of consumption, you need to take it with another grain of salt. And by this time, you might as well set up a salt mining business with the amount you've had to take in this video. The self-reported data, the fact that it's hard to separate out just whether or not cannabis alone or cannabis and tobacco or how much cannabis is in a joint, all of this creates a variety of confounding variables that will need to be elaborated on in future research. However, it is consistent with other research that has found cannabis users have an increased risk of certain health effects, notably bronchitis. Going now from the naked ape and all of its weirdness to Arctic sponges. Arctic sponges are a particular species that has evolved to cope with a lack of sunlight, extreme cold, and rather inhospitable conditions. Frankly, the fact that they exist at all is impressive. The fact they live in an environment where there's a lack of light, heat, and sustenance makes us wonder just how they do it. And this is where scientists looking into the ocean have at least come to a sort of answer. The sponges live with a symbiote organism. These symbiotes take existing organic matter, especially ancient organic matter, and convert that into something that the sponges can then use. This is things like the protein and chitin from ancient sea worms. This is not a unique phenomena. For example, truffles work in conjunction with various trees and provide a mutually beneficial arrangement, and sponges are well known to do this as well. It's an especially important thing to do as they have no muscles, nerves, or organs. And that means that they must work with something in order to be able to pull in all the necessary nutrition and other things they need. Going from weird sea sponges to chimps, and the use of insects to try and help deal with wounds. Chimps using tools is not new. Admittedly, they've generally relied on very basic and rudimentary tools, but tools nonetheless. The use of insects, especially with regards to wounds, is very new, very interesting, and very weird, as it is a relatively advanced technique to use, especially when we're talking about apes. Although the information isn't exactly able to specify what was being used, it was clear that chimps were using insects and applying them directly to wounds, whether they were immediately open wounds or older wounds, and that it wasn't just a chimp doing it to themselves, but that a chimp may do it to another chimp, or collect the insect and then provide it to the first chimp so they could then treat themselves. This is a collective social behavior that was to the benefit of the community and the individual, going from mysterious chimp behavior that is far too human for our liking to frankly disconcerting and disgusting news. Starfish have been turning into strange group for quite a while now, and it's unclear as to what was happening. It was thought that it could possibly be something pathogenic, for example, a bacteria, parasite, or virus that was causing them to basically die and melt. The researchers decided to look at the starfish that were nearby, if not next to each other, in areas where some were wasting away and others seemingly weren't affected. If it was something like a virus, bacteria, or parasite, theoretically they should all be infected and effected. After analysing the genome, they didn't find anything specifically related to the survivability of some of these starfish over others. And that's important. There was no clear-cut relationship between particular genes and susceptibility to disease. There were, however, certain areas of the genome that seemed to be associated with survivability, and these need to be looked at more closely. Adding to the DNA research this week regarding marine life, researchers were trying to take samples from deep within the ocean, the darkest, deepest recesses that can't be readily accessed, and trying to identify if there is life down there that we can't find further up and closer to the top of the ocean. What they found was the vast majority of the organisms deep in the ocean are genetically unique and distinct from anything closer to where we can find them easily. These are creatures where you must send deep diving unmanned vehicles in order to be able to survive the trip and collect things safely. Nearly all of this life was, if not microscopic, close enough to. In this case, a large amount of it was plankton or microbes. This doesn't mean that it's a complete waste of time though. Most of these organisms can survive for incredibly long times within the soil, and this means that if you can take a sample by drilling down into the ground or bedrock of the deep ocean, you can begin to extract living organisms for quite a ways. And given the way the ocean sedimentation works, you can get a very good picture of how organisms have changed over time based on what particular living organisms are at what level. Going from the deepest, darkest recesses of Earth to instead the very periphery of Earth. That is our stratosphere and above. Astronomers are trying to push back against SpaceX's space pollution in the form of their Starlink satellites that are causing all kinds of issues with regards to astronomy. There are currently up to 5,000 satellites in space for Starlink. A large number of these have not been modified to make them less intrusive. This means that they are getting in the way of space photography, astronomy, and other studies that look at the sky and try to figure out what's going on. This is a big problem. This is where the representative body, the International Astronomical Union, has announced that they're trying to get together and create a centre that will push for their representation and rights. It's called the IAU Centre for Protection of the Dark and Quiet Sky from Satellite Constellation Interference. Admittedly, that is a mouthful. Admittedly, though, it also does tell you everything you need to know about what they're trying to achieve. Their focus is primarily on both optical and radio telescopes. In the case of an optical telescope, they need to be away from light pollution, and as we've mentioned, these satellites don't really fit with that bill. They unfortunately reflect quite a bit of light, and this creates issues. Radio telescopes are also similarly hampered, but in a different way. Take, for example, Starlink's service. They're intending to use radio frequencies to provide broadband internet. Great if you can't access fixed cable or have ridiculously crappy internet service. The problem is, some of these radio frequencies are the same that radio telescopes use. Imagine what's going to happen if Starlink gets its full set of satellites into the sky, and it's possibly up to 10,000 of them at the moment. That means that ground-based researchers could never do anything they're trying to do. It would be a sky full of satellites sending signals down to Earth that directly interfere with radio telescopes. The light reflected off these satellites would prevent optical telescopes from being used. This all becomes a huge issue very quickly. It would appear in our final piece of news for this week that the sun is on the side of the astronomers. In an unfortunate twist of fate, SpaceX has lost a large number of the Starlink satellites it was trying to deploy recently. 40 satellites went into space, and the vast majority of these are going to be destroyed. That's because when they went into space, there was a solar storm. This was causing issues to do with their orientation, and so they had to lock themselves in a particular direction so as to not be destroyed. When they tried to come out of that orientation and engage their thrusters to move higher up into the atmosphere so they could remain there, they appear to have been unable to do so. This means that they are going to crash back down to Earth, and in doing so, they will burn up. The overly simplified version of what's happened is that Earth's atmosphere will become somewhat more dense during these storms. SpaceX tries to deploy the satellites at about 210 kilometers from Earth. At that height, they can use their thrusters to move to a safer location and remain in orbit. Deploying them at this height means that if they don't deploy successfully, they can be destroyed via the atmosphere burning them up. It's effectively the best balancing act between these two events. In the future, SpaceX will likely have to shift towards a more successful-oriented and biased approach, meaning they'll be deployed higher up into orbit, which means there's more difficulty in disposing of them if they fail. That's because the density of the atmosphere is likely to remain denser for longer for a variety of reasons going forwards. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.